We're continuing in our discussion of cheese making here in the Shulchan Aruch. We are in Yoreh Deah, Pei Zion, chapter 87, and we've been going over the Seifim, Tes, Yud. Recently, we're now going to move on to Yud Aleph, number 11. We're going to talk about the actual cheese making process that is the preferable method in which it is done. So we've been talking about previously about what if you found it like this and if you found it like that, but now we're going to say, now you went ahead and used the stomach to go ahead and make the cheese. All right, you didn't do anything else crazy about it. You want to do the normal right thing. Okay, and we're going to use a kosher stomach to do that. So this halacha in Yud Aleph is if you go ahead, all right, so using the stomach still to make the cheese. So you put your milk in there, and it's from a kosher animal. If there is meat flavor that goes into the cheese, it is prohibited. And if there's not a meat flavor, it's mutter. So what do you do? Look at cheese, right? What do you do? So, but if you go ahead and make cheese from non-kosher things, such as the stomach of a animal that died on its own, an animal that died either because it had a broken leg or other limb that would cause it to be a treifa, and some type of prohibited animal that you could never eat, like a camel or a pig, you can't use that stomach at all to make cheese. The Ramah adds, because that is called something that is ma'amid, is a prohibited thing, and it causes the cheese to become a solidified object. And such a thing known as a ma'amid is prohibited even in 1,000 times the flavor. And that's only if, the Ramah says, Shelo hayasham ma'amid acher rak he'aser. There is only the prohibited one. Aval im hayagam kein ma'amid heter. So if you have a permitted type of thing that causes it to coagulate, this is, both of these contribute, umutter, and that is a permitted action. Im ikashishim neged ha'aser. As long as you have 60 times against that, because I already said in the first half you can't have flavor from the meat. So let's talk about this. Where does this come from, that you want to make cheese in the stomach? So we've touched on it. So this comes from the Mishnah in Chulin. Okay, so the Mishnah is back on page 117a. It says, right? So the Mishnah says you put the milk in the stomach. If it makes it taste meaty, there's no good. And if it's questioned if it's Basar b'chalav, and if it's not, then it should be okay. So that's the first thing. The Gemara asks that you can't use kavas nevela, if you saw that earlier. So you can't use the stomach of an animal that didn't have kosher shchita to it, that wasn't slaughtered properly. However, maybe you could use something that was not a problem. That it was the shchita was no good on it, but maybe you could. Okay, and then we talked about the outside of it as well. Because, again, this ma'amid thing is an issue. That's what the Gemara talks about over there. That's what we say. Okay? So, that's what we say. But the stomach is okay because the stomach is not considered real food. That's what our Gemara says in Chulin. There's another Mishnah in Avodah Zarah where it's talking about prohibiting non-Jewish cheese. And the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, it's on Chavtes Amud Beis. It quotes a discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yeshua asks Rabbi Yishmael, he says, they were taking a walk, and he asks him, why did they prohibit cheese purchased from non-Jews? What did they do that's not acceptable? They said they put that into the stomach of non-kosher animals. Okay, so we say that if there's a stomach that you use from an Ola offering, right? If you were to eat that, if a Kohen were to go ahead and eat that, Rabbi Yeshua asks him, it's nasty, but there's nothing to hold him. He's not liable for consuming a prohibited object because it's considered not edible. So he says, they said you're not supposed to do it, but there's no prohibition violated. So why is this a problem as well? So Rabbi Yishmael says back to him, because it is the stomach of animals that were actually offered to idols. So not only were they improperly slaughtered, but they were also offered to idols as well. So he says, so why is it not also prohibited rabbinically from benefit? And so then he says, just talk about something else. So Gemara asks over there, So they say it's something about gvinas onaiki, which is mixed with non-kosher wine. So that is something else. So the Gemara also says over there, because they don't properly clean the water, and the water can have issues with it. And another problem is also because of the cheese could be made from milk that has non-kosher milk in it, and the non-kosher milk will sit inside of the kosher milk. Okay? And then the other issue is that the Gemara comes out with, because they use the skin from the outside lining of the stomach. So that's the Gemara says over there. So that's where our source of our halacha comes from in the Shulchan Aruch. Now, is there a difference between the outside lining? So the stomach of the cow is a little bit different. They have this inner lining on the inside. It's very intricate. And remember, they have different parts to the cow stomachs. It goes in one way, it goes out another way, it comes back in and goes in through other places. That we're not going to go through the whole anatomy of a cow. Just know that over here we're talking about the first entranceway, the keva. All right, there's other parts as well, the emzis and other things too. Basar Kosher. We're not going to deal with how the whole stomach goes through, because we're not worried about milk staying in there, because at that point it's been digested and isn't usable for this. We need the regular stomach enzymes and not the other part, which helps to break down the more difficult things that cows generally eat, which is cellulose when they eat the grass. So the question is, so why is there a difference between using the outside lining and why does that have to be from a kosher animal if it's not considered actual meat at all? We already learned that if it's basically dry like a stick, what are we worried about? So here's the question that the Rishonim ask when dealing with this problem. So Tosfos asks on the Gemara Avodah Zarah, so why does it matter to say that it's not kosher? Even a kosher slaughtered one should be a problem of Basar b'chalav, which is what seems to be the problem in the Mishnah in Chulin. Tosfos asked that question. So when we compare the two cases, say the problem is using that. So it says it has to be a Torah prohibition. However, by Basar b'chalav, when we're talking about Basar b'chalav, there's no cooking involved, so it's only rabbinic. So that's why they weren't so strict on it. But if I take non-kosher and let it sit there and add flavor, that's why there's an issue. Okay, so not in the case of something's cold. That is the response of Tosfos. So what's actually interesting is that the Gra actually points something out over here. Very interesting as well. So he says the following. He says that the outer lining of the cave, of the stomach, is really, really small. Okay? And he also says that it's considered something that is used to preserve and coagulate the cheese. We call that ma'amid. And that's a problem even when there's less than 60 times. So the Gemara is only talking about when there is 60 times against it. And so even according to Tosfos, who are saying that it's a kosher stomach, there's still a rabbinic prohibition of ma'amid, and there should be no bittul for them to say, hey, this shouldn't really be a problem. Okay, and it's only a rabbinic prohibition. Yes, it is only a rabbinic prohibition, but that's why we have this separate one to deal with. So the Gra has that problem with Tosfos. So Rabbi Kiva Eger, in addressing this issue with Tosfos, he says that Tosfos is talking about when there actually isn't 60, and that seems to make the most sense, is because that every little bit from the stomach that goes in there makes the cheeses. So it's really, everyone would agree that the cheese is being made through this thing. So every single thing you put in there is an issue of ma'amid, but that it's the question is really only of whether or not we have some type of stronger prohibition that's acting against it. So when the Gemara in Avodah Zarah concludes that it's because of the fact that the skin itself came from the non-kosher animal, because that's the only time when there actually is a Torah prohibition involved. But everything else would only be rabbinic, and that's why Tosfos was talking about that. So because everyone agrees that ma'amid is a problem. Then there's the Rambam. Okay. So the Rambam says something a little different. He says it's prohibited to make cheese from the skin of the animal stomach, even if it's kosher slaughtered. And if you make it, you have to taste the cheese. If the cheese has a meat flavor in it, you cannot eat the cheese. If there is no meat flavor in it, you may eat the cheese, because you have gone ahead and used a kosher starter to make the cheese, but that the skin of the stomach itself adds meat flavor. And so the only problem to adjust for over here is the level of meat in it to give it a flavor of meat. But the actual process of making the cheese itself would only be a problem if you use something non-kosher, like nevela, where they improperly slaughtered the cow. Or it was not kosher because it had some broken lung, some broken limb, something broken in it. Or it's from a non-kosher animal in general, like a pig or a camel. And those things would make the cheese completely prohibited as soon as you drop the orikeva in there. So you drop the stomach skin into it, because of this prohibition and not because of basar b'chalav. And that's why they made a prohibition to buy cheese from non-Jews. And that is what the Rambam writes. Okay? And the Rif says this. It's echoed also in the Rashba, in the Rosh, in the Ran. This is the most popular. This is the most popular opinion. And so, therefore, the difference between the two of them is whether or not it's accomplishing the issue through a kosher way or a non-kosher way. So the question is if there's a rabbinic prohibition on it. So there's one other thing mentioned that's not that's different. Tosfos mentions in another place, quoting Rabbeinu Tam, another prohibition, that nowadays we don't really find a whole reason to prohibit cheese altogether. This is Rabbeinu Tam's novel approach. Why? Because everything has to do with either meat flavor or non-kosher meat or non-kosher that. And everybody says it has to do with something non-kosher going into the cheese. So let's say you put nothing non-kosher in there. So therefore, the halacha is that these cheeses should be okay. Okay? And so since everyone seems to say that that's the halacha, that only has to do with having the non-kosher stuff going into it, he says if it's that, then we don't have to worry about certain things going into it. So he says, but now there's another problem, which is that now what if they do use the stomachs here and they put flavor into it? So then there's partially reason to prohibit it because they do salt it as well. We mentioned salting in the last year. And that would be a problem because it prohibits it very quickly. Okay? And this Rabbeinu Tam seems to say that it's okay. So that's one thing. Now there's another part of this Tosfos that also points out that the Rabbeinu Tam also points out that they only use flowers, parachim is what he says. So that's another thing that he points out. Is even if you wanted to hold that the opinion, you wanted to bypass all the other opinions if they're not using it. So Rabbeinu Tam basically says that this prohibition doesn't apply anymore. So, and he doesn't make this distinction like we see in the Shulchan Aruch over here. So, just so you know, the Marshal makes a interesting point that maybe it should be, if you use a non-kosher starter, it should be batal. Now the Shach goes on this Marshal, and he says that he doesn't believe that the Marshal is correct for quoting this opinion. So the main difference seems to be about whether or not you have an actual benefit from this non-kosher item. And if the non-kosher item is providing an actual noticeable benefit to it. So in our case, we see there's clearly a prohibition. And the question is whether or not there's a rabbinic prohibition in these cases, and if it's a basar b'chalav prohibition, or if it's a ma'amid prohibition. So ma'amid is going to be a problem whether or not it's meat flavored, and basar b'chalav is going to be a problem if it's meat flavored. Okay? So based on this, it seems to make sense that when the cheese is made through adding this animal skin as rennet into it, it's going to be a problem if it's going to put flavor into it, and whether or not it's going to put flavor into it immediately or not. So that's going to be part of the issue. So those are all things to consider. Let's look at what ma'amid is, when it's discussed in other situations, to understand if this ma'amid thing right, where I said it causes something to come into to being, is a Torah prohibition or rabbinic prohibition. So the question is whether or not it's a Torah prohibition or not. So there's a Magen Avraham. This is an Orach Chaim. This is in Laws of Chametz and Pesach, and it's in 442. And he says that some people say that that this issue of putting chametz into something else, and it makes something else become something else, is only a rabbinic prohibition, even when it's less than 60 times. Okay. However, the reason why it's prohibited according to the Torah is because it's considered like you can still see that the prohibited substance is there, and so therefore that becomes a Torah prohibition. If it's not batal, then it's nicker. And nicker means that you are eating that thing. You can recognize it, and it's still a Torah prohibition. So you're actually eating that thing. And therefore you still have to go ahead and burn that as real chametz. Okay? And he quotes that there's other Rishonim who says this as well. So the one thing about, we learned from chametz and also from sourdough, from the actual leavened product and from sourdough product, is that the Torah was trying to point out that if there is something that is really a powerful contributor to it, that it's considered noticeable. Okay? And that's why the Torah itself says, Sa'or lo yimatzev b'atechem. You shall not find Sa'or. V'chol machmetzes, anything that becomes leavened. Right? It doesn't just say bread. It could just say bread. Right? It's talking about things that are somewhat recognizable too. And the Machatzis Shekel, who's a commentary on top of the Magen Avraham, said that there's a number of opinions that seem to notice that there is a difference of opinion as to whether it's rabbinic or Torah level. And it seems that in our case, even the Torah would agree that this is a rabbinic problem, because no one seems to say that this is a Torah level problem. All the approaches we've approached have said it's a rabbinic problem. So there's a shach much later on, and it's also noticed by the Chachmas Adam and the Chok Yaakov. Okay, the Pri Megadim brings it up in our halacha here, and he points it out as well, that my meat is really rabbinic, and this idea, this problem is not the biggest problem in the world. So they all notice it, and they take notice to it. But just so we know and are clear that my meat is an Issur Rabbanan. Okay, and that's what everybody seems to approach it as. Let's see. Okay, so is there an amount of time for when ma meat applies? Okay, so is it something that it has to stay for a while, or does it happen immediately? So when you make cheese, as soon as you drop the activator in there, it starts curdling. You see, it happens immediately because it's an enzyme, so it immediately starts to react. So some opinions, like the Yad Yehuda, are strict. He says that the prohibition is even when it hasn't waited in there very long, because you see, boom, it's going, okay? And so immediately you're going to be assuming that the flavor has gone into it. In the commentary of Kreisi Uplesi, he says that even though the flavor hasn't had enough time to be absorbed into it, you're still going to see it making the activity. So it's not about the flavor, it's about the activity. And therefore it's prohibited because of the Avar Hamamid, okay? And so there are people who add, he quotes this other Rishon called Tosfos Rid. I'm not getting into how he is a Rishon, but he says that's also when the flavor would expand into it and would be a problem at that point as well. So now there's another prohibition of rulis kaved. So let's say I made the cheese, and I want the cheese to actually become batal in other cheeses. Is there a problem of, let's say, having a whole bunch of slices get mixed together, and it's a slice what I'd normally give you? If you say I would like some cheese, I give you this slice about this size. So if I mixed it in with other cheeses, would that be considered rulis kaved or not? Because generally speaking, when I say I can't make something that's recognizable prohibited, that's recognizable in the mixture, and it's not considered to be nullified in the mixture. So the question is, when this thing isn't itself actually prohibited, but just because of another mixture, so it's two separate mixtures. So do we apply two separate prohibitions on it? So the rule is roilis kaved, if something is worthy of being served to you, and it mixes in with other items that are worthy of being served to you, and it gets mixed in with something not kosher, I'm not allowed to serve any of them because I can't serve you that much prohibited substance. So if I get a bunch of chicken breasts and one whole chicken breast is not kosher, I can't serve any of those chicken breasts to you because of how large they are. So in our case, the Taz actually asks this question. And he says that if you have non-kosher cheese, the cheese that was purchased from a non-Jew, and that is there's a question. So whether or not it was mixed in with there's a question if it was made with non-kosher milk. That we don't say in such a case that cheese is considered too large. Okay, that's worthy of serving before you. Why? Because there's a majority of animals that are kosher, and the majority of milk is kosher. And there's also not an honorable size by cheese to serve to somebody. However, that's only when it's talking about the milk. But if you use the non-kosher skin in it, then that's considered a serviceable piece. Because it's different between the cheese only comes about through the use of the non-kosher thing versus the cheese having something non-kosher mixed into it. So he would say that if you had blocks of cheese and you're not sure which ones came from the kosher one, which came from the not kosher one, if they were large chunks that you would serve to somebody, then all the cheeses are prohibited. Okay, and so that's considered a very specific item that is prohibited. Okay, now there is the couple of other people who have issues with this. So there are people. There's other people who agree with Taz. So that all types of cheeses should be prohibited, but they don't agree with him. But all types of cheeses should be prohibited because they are considered themselves something as an absolute rabbinic prohibition. Okay, and so therefore they shouldn't be permitted, even with the distinction that Taz makes. Okay. He also points out that even if you were to try to rely on Rabbeinu Tam's opinion, that even if they're mixed with grasses and flowers, where there's none of these prohibitions at all, nonetheless, since there was a rabbinic restriction on them, they're considered a prohibited substance. Okay. So that's what he says. The Shach agrees also that there shouldn't be this distinction that Taz makes, that every single piece of cheese should be considered worthy of being served, or is kaved, and all the other Achronim seem to side with that as well, but everyone seems to agree that there is a deal with that. However, there is the Chavas Das that is lenient. He says there's no that by something that is set with something non-kosher, that Ruli's kaved doesn't apply. And therefore, he disagrees completely with everybody. So he says it's like something that was absorbed flavor. So that's the interesting opinion of the Chavas Das. So does anybody rely on this Chavas Das? So the later Achronim seem to not take that side for the most part. Okay, but if there's a really big loss, so there's the Minchas Yaakov, who said that, since we also mentioned there's this also opinion of Marshal I mentioned earlier to rely on Rabbeinu Tam. They say that maybe if it's really a big deal, that it might be a problem. And he also argues that maybe that the rule has changed and there's no din of release kavi by cheese at all. And so, therefore, he says it's worth the argument. So, since someone says it explicitly that there may be room to be lenient, even though everyone else seems to argue that there could be room to argue that maybe there isn't. Okay. So we mentioned in the Ramah Zev Zigorem. Now, what does that refer to? Okay. So the Mishnah that talked about this idea of Zev Zigorem Mutter. So this law is from a Mishnah in Orla. So in Orla, it talks about if you take sourdough, okay? One sourdough is from regular food, and the other sourdough is made from truma. So again, truma can only be eaten by kohanim. And they fall into a dough. Neither one of them can cause the dough to leaven without the other. And when you mix them together and mix them in the bread, it makes it into sourdough bread, okay? Okay, or even if it's not so sourdoughy, you're able to leaven the bread with it because it's the yeast starter. So Rabbi Eliezer holds you follow whichever one falls in last, and the rabbis say it doesn't matter what time it falls in, it's only prohibited until you have the amount that's in there that could make it into a leaven product on its own. Okay, and we paskin like the Chachamim. So the Tosfos brings up this Mishnah in the Gemara Avodah Zarah that we were talking about earlier, and they argue that it has to be in a case of where it has to be able to leaven on its own. And the Rambam also agrees with this as well, that if the prohibited substance could fall in and cause it to leaven on its own, it would still be prohibited, even though it has both of them together. Okay? Now, the next time this is really debated is in the Pri Megadim, and he points out that when the Ramah says Zev Zagorm would be okay, he says if there is enough prohibited stomach skin or keva in order to make the cheese, that's going to prohibit it. Okay, so even if you have enough from the kosher one, you can't just throw in both. Okay, so however, the Yad Yehuda disagrees. He says no, that if you have enough permitted substance in there, even if you have enough prohibited substance in there, that will also be a Zev Zagorm and cancel each other out. Okay? So, however, the only leniency is if they both need each other, you can be lenient on it. It's only a problem if it's going to be the prohibited substance alone that's going to try to do that. So the Shach adds another interesting comment over here. He limits this to a case of where it's leavening, okay? And that's a question of whether or not it has enough to leaven the item. And that's when it's the problem, because there's also the flavor of it as well. So when it comes to making cheese, this could actually be different. That in this case, the Zev Zagorm would be actually more lenient. So because you don't actually get any flavor in it. So even if you only threw in a little bit of the prohibited stuff, since there's no flavor, that wouldn't be prohibited. So it makes it a little bit more lenient, since you're not going to notice the flavor of the stomach skin, right? Because you're going to take it out. But by dough, you would notice the yeast flavor. Okay, and so that's why the leniency quoted by the Ramah, it has to be something where it adds something to it. Okay, but only prohibited stuff would prohibit it. Okay, so now if this case of Zev Zagorm what if one after the other goes in, which we mentioned in the Mishnah? So the Pri Megadim deals with this again, and he says that is even if they go one and after the other, as long as the prohibited substance can't start the cheese process on its own. You need both of them, okay? So that's why. But if there is enough of the prohibited substance to go ahead and start the cheese going, and it goes in first, so then you don't really need the head there. So he points that out as a problem. So the Pri Chadash disagrees a little bit, and he says that's not really the point. The point is that you're trying to make it work, and if you're going to make it go with both of them, even if the prohibited stuff goes in first, as long as you add in the kosher stuff, that's okay. And he says, however, if you put the prohibited stuff in second, that would prohibit it all, because you added enough to make it cheese afterwards. So he has the opposite problem. Okay, and so therefore, using the case of this Mishnah Arla is not really such a great idea. So let's go and explain all this back in the words of the Mechaber and the Ramah. So when the Ramah says, when the Mechaber says that if you were to use the stomach, the skin of the stomach, the or keva, and it's ksheva, that's okay. So the Mechaber and the Ramah all agree with the opinion of the Rambam, the Rif, Rashba, and Ran, and Rush that we quoted earlier in our discussion. The Ramah seems to also agree with the Mordechai that we just mentioned about Zev Zagorm. Okay, and so that all is okay. Okay. Now the halacha is that if there's not enough prohibited substance to make the cheeses on their own, Okay, and that's what, and the Taz agrees with that, and the Shach agrees with that, and that seems to be what everybody says on their own, right? But if it's a really, if there's a really case of a great need, if there's enough permitted in there to go ahead and cause it, if there's more than it, okay, so then that would be permitted as long as there's more than 60 times against it. Okay, so let's see a couple of other interesting things over here. So that's what we see, that according to the Rambam in the Shulchan Aruch, so that you don't have a prohibition at all. Okay, and also there's no problem of mevatel isur l'chadchila. Why? Because it was never prohibited when you made the mixture. Mevatel isur l'chadchila means you're not allowed to mix something in there intentionally to not have any flavor go in, and that's what the Mechaber also holds in this case. We'll come back to mevatel isur l'chadchila later on in another case. There's a nice discussion on it. So the Shach makes an important point over here. He says that when there's not 60 times of the amount of milk being made into cheese against the amount of rennet skin that you're adding into the mixture, then he says that according to the Mechaber, that one interesting thing you could do is, if you can't measure it and you're not sure if there were 60 times against it, you could have a non-Jew come and taste it, and he relies on that. So that's something that for those who hold like the Mechaber, like the Sephardic poskim, that would be okay. But if there should be flavor in it, we don't. The Ashkenazi poskim who follow the Ramah, this comes on later on in Sadi Ches, would not rely on this, and so therefore that's why you always need to follow 60, and that's why the Ramah mentions 60 times, and the Shulchan Aruch says flavor. So the case of where the Mechaber says that you can't use something non-kosher, the Shach also says there that it's allowed because it's a gorem that's permitted, right? So it's a ma'amid that's kosher, and there's no prohibition in there at all, and because it's not even basar chalav, because it's all cold. And so as long as it doesn't sit in there for very long, it's also fine to continue to leave it in there while the cheese is being made. So you have to take it out at some point. Okay, but if using something that's non-kosher to begin with, then we have to see if it's still there or not. Okay, and so therefore, he says that that's not permitted. So the Shach also points out that he brings up the Marshal in the same statement. He says that he doesn't agree with the Marshal, but as we mentioned earlier, there are some poskim who were even lenient in that case as well. The Madni Ashulchan, who I've mentioned several times before, big fan of his, that since the Minchas Yitzchak found reasons to be lenient on it, that as long as you remove it at the moment it starts to curdle, as long as it doesn't finish, okay? So he brings up that leniency. Okay, so that's when the Marshal, you could apply leniency. However, he said then that if the prohibition would also apply in the same way as well. If you put it in there and it starts to curdle, then you've got to take it. Then that's when it's already prohibited, according to the Mechaber. Okay, so if you need to rely on leniencies on that moment's an important time period. The Ramah, who says that you have to have the Isser and Heter mixed together for it to be permitted, so that it seems, so we have to make it clear that it might seem from the Ramah that as long as you have both there, it's okay, but that's not really what it seems to say. The Shach says that it's only when the Isser doesn't have enough to make it on its own. Okay, as we explained from the Pri Megadim, other sources, that's when it's, so if you add enough rennet in there that's from a non-kosher source, you can't rely on that. And the Pri Megadim says that it doesn't matter when you add it in, first or afterwards. We've mentioned there were some people who are lenient in those cases. Okay, and you also have to have 60 times against it. Okay, so let's go over some of the rules we just learned here in making cheese with the keva, with the stomach, which was back in the day how they made it. So we saw that Tosfos holds that as long as the cheese is from a kosher, is made with a kosher source, but you're using something that's non-kosher, okay, that there's a problem that if you use something that's from a non-kosher source at all, okay. So and if you put something from that non-kosher source, like the stomach comes from a nevela, that's when this would be a problem. All right, so that's when they say that would be a problem. So now the Rambam distinguishes, unlike Tosfos did, that if it's something that is from a kosher animal, the flavor is one thing to worry about, but the ma'amid, the idea of making the cheese, is a separate prohibition. So therefore, you're not allowed to use non-kosher starters to make the cheese, and you can use a kosher one as long as it's less than 60 times and there's more than 6 times the amount of milk against the starter skin from the kosher animal. And then there's the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that he seems to say, well, as long as there's no flavor, then nothing's going to be a problem. And the Marshal allows that. Okay? And you can, as long as there's no flavor from it. However, that there is a prohibition of ma'amid, and everyone seems to agree that's midrabanan, except for this one opinion in the Magen Avraham, but we don't seem to agree with that, and so therefore it's only a consideration when when it's mixed, when there's a mixture of other things, of whether or not we consider the cheese mixture to be ru'ylis kaved or not. So now that we say that it's only a rabbinic prohibition, then the question is, well, is there ru'ylis kaved by cheese? And so we say not only is ma'amid a problem, but then now that the rabbis answered it, now it's going to be a problem if it's too large of a piece of a mixture. Okay, so therefore it's only like grated cheese where mixture can be batel b'rov. But if it's blocks of cheese that you would normally serve to people, that's something else. And we saw that most people say that's a problem. There's this one lenient opinion of the Chavas Das, and so therefore there's no opinion of ru'ylis kaved, and so only in great necessity could you rely on such an opinion. And we would also include the opinion of the Marshal, who quotes the Rabbeinu Tam. You have to add all those guys together so you make sure they all line up. And so then we also learned that there has to be more kosher ma'amid, more than the prohibited one. And we said that you can't have one go without the other. And we also concluded that even with the opinion of the Marshal, that as soon as you start to make the cheese and it starts to curdle, that's the moment when the Isser applies. So if you were relying on a leniency, you have to rely on, let's say, that Marshal and the Chavas Das and add all these guys up. You would have to do that in a situation where you haven't let it add flavor to the mixture yet, which means it hasn't sat in there for, if it's salted for 18 minutes and if it's unsalted for 24 hours. And if it's a permitted substance that goes in there first, as long as the one that comes after that's prohibited is also not enough to have made the cheese on its own. So in those situations, or if you did, you'd have to rely on that Marshal and the Chavas Das to permit a mixture. Or if it's to permit the cheese, you would have to find a way to permit the Marshal. And so that would be a problem once it started to curl, because you lose that Chavas Das if it's not in the mixture. Thank you for joining our class this time. We're going to have a review session for the sifm that we learned about cheese before we move on to Siman Pei Ches, which will bring us into a new chapter of learning. And thank you very much for your attendance and your listening as we finish up Pei Zayin together this week.